still lagging behind. So it's this same scenario of how do I take a bigger, more broader look at what does wealth and health mean to me and to my family? And these are conversations with partners that we don't always have either, right? It's so that again, it's a question an advisor could ask, at the table with a couple. Like, so what does wealth and health mean to you? Why are we doing this? That's what I could like. Why are we bothering to accumulate all this money? What's it for? Right? We think it's an obvious answer, but I can tell you that people will surprise you with their responses.
Well, that's a great point, and asking both partners in the relationship is critical. You do that in risk tolerance, and you find that just because they're married or been living together doesn't mean that they both share the same risk tolerance. This is the Future Ready Advisor, a show about transforming your financial advisory practice. I'm your host, Sam Sivarajan, a wealth management consultant, behavioral scientist, and keynote speaker. In this podcast, I dive deep into the real challenges advisors face and bring you insightful conversations with top industry experts. Together, we'll explore practical strategies grounded in behavioral science to help you better serve your clients, optimize your time, and build a future-ready practice. Hi, everyone. I'm your host, Sam Sivarajan. Welcome to today's episode of the Future Ready Advisor. Today, I'm here with Scott Fulton, the author of the book Wealthspan. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sam. Great to be with you. Really looking forward to our conversation today.
Me too. I think it's very timely. Let me quickly introduce you to the audience. Scott's work is all about helping us live not just longer, but better by making sure our wealth and health grow together. He lectures on positive aging at 2 university campuses, is a member of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, sits on the prestigious True Health Initiative Council, and is past president of the National Aging in Place Council. His book, Wealthspan, More Years, More Moments, More Money, made #1 on Amazon. Scott is also an Ironman triathlete and lives with his wife in Charlottesville, Virginia. Whether you're a financial advisor or just someone looking to optimize your life, you won't want to miss this conversation. Scott, when I think about wealth and health, I can't help but think about that old joke, till you turn 40, you run with your health after your money. After 40, you run with your money after your health. I can certainly attest to the truth of that statement. Can you share a bit about your journey and what inspired you to write the book, and what personal or professional experiences led you to explore this intersection between health and wealth?
Sure, Sam. So maybe there's kind of a funny story that I talk about. When I turned 40, my midlife crisis was not to go buy the convertible, but I went and bought a bike. And that was really a big turning point. It kind of reconnected me with my youth and continues to probably be my favorite activity. I think my experience with aging, I started to be an observer quite young. And so I had a really positive influence with my grandmother, with her cherry red 1967, I think, Chevy Impala 2-door 327 soft top when she pulled up, and I thought, aging isn't all bad. I tell you, that stayed with me all these years of what it can be. But in parallel, as I watched other people, and that was probably through my parents' circle of friends, I observed a number of kind of senior executives, CEOs, kind of go through their retirement or enter in and kind of follow them through over the years that followed. And I saw a really kind of hit and miss, unpredictable outcome that they were experiencing in retirement, which really, I think, caught my attention and continued my curiosity. And as I went through, I'm a researcher, I'm a big data analyst, I've always been there and moved through lots of areas of research. I started to look for it more again as I got into my 50s and started to dive in more. And so what I started to see were what was missing. Right? We all like to think, we look at population data and we all would like to assume that we're all going to be at the median. or the average, depending on what data set you're looking at. And of course, reality is n equals 1. And so what I started to look into was, well, why is your n equal 1 different than the person next to you who seems to have followed a similar pattern? And it just has led to, I think, a lot more nuanced understanding of what's happening as we age, and really those who age well, why do they age well? And you start to realize we've got a view in the US that it's all socioeconomic and it's all money related. Again, that's kind of navel gazing. I would suggest money is certainly an easier part of it. It makes it easier. But money is not going to buy you health in your later years. There are other things that factor in. And so that's kind of what set me down the path, and just has opened all sorts of rabbit holes that I've gone down, and tried to pull out a few.
It's an interesting point that you make, and I totally agree with it. The idea that it isn't all about money and wealth. I know that is sacrilegious to say that, but I think it's not just a U.S. phenomena, it's a Canadian phenomena as well. You're a data person. How much do you feel that that's got to do with, if you can count it, it's measurable, it's trackable and everything else, but that some of these other concepts that you're talking about are alluding to, whether it's society, your place in society, community, having a good group of friends, or social network, we all can say that's important, but because we can't necessarily quantify it or track it, that it somehow loses that sort of focus or priority that one might think that you would give otherwise.
Yeah, I think well, so what I always caution people is stop looking for the easy answer, right? They kind of say, well, what's the one thing I could do? I say, well, the one thing you could do is stop thinking there's only one thing you can do. The art, aging is an art. There are many things we need to do on that brush stroke, and how we dip the paintbrush, how we mix the paints to get the result that we're looking for. There are clearly measurable impacts, and so what I kind of am remembering it. Your audience is largely Canadian, is that right?
Yep.
Yep. So I was up in Canada, gave a talk recently, and one of the hospital CEOs showed up for my talk, which I always like to have in the audience. That kind of level is that once I'm been many years in Canada, so I know the Canadian system pretty well, and I move back and forth. So I'll always caution people: don't think because you're in Canada that you're insulated from the impact in the U.S. Essentially, all the trends follow. We know this. Mm-hmm. They tend to lag by about 5 years, and so we're seeing the same thing happen in longevity and health outcomes. The difference is really when we start to measure the big on our equity, right? And so in the market, in the financial market, we love to talk about market volatility. Why do we do that? We talk about it because we want to calm the client down around the things that will get our client anxious. Mm-hmm. And then I'll so when I talk to health, well, we don't want to talk about health. We're going to get them too anxious. Well, that's the same response they have to market volatility. In health, they have actually a lot more influence than they do over what the markets are doing. And so there's a place to play here, because what we understand is nothing will impact outcomes in terms of financial outcomes more than health and their home. And if we're not making thoughtful planning decisions well in advance, we are going to pay significantly more in later years for both health and housing options, primarily because we haven't planned it well enough. And so we're left with short-term decisions that has to be made in a matter of days versus, over a 5 or 10 year window. And so we can measure certainly the cost of what ill health has or chronic disease in later years, even by all of the support services that we're going to need later. Even though we may view that our medical is covered, there are all the other costs that are going to wrap up onto that. And then, ultimately it's that, what is wealth? Right? Is it money or is it health? In reality, that's why Wealthspan is really having both, or I call it the trifecta. You have wealth, you health, and you have lifespan. And so you really want all three of those. And so we've got to look to understand what are the other things that are touching money. And if anyone's worked with clients towards the end, they have seen how fast the money starts to pour out. The one example I offer there is the financial cliff, where we have two housing scenarios where one needs to go into a facility to get care. Partner is going to stay at home. And suddenly the housing costs will probably go up to 3 or 4x when you add the healthcare piece to it. And part of my other work is, what are we doing for the survivor, right? What is the survivor going to be left with? So this is all kind of the planning window that we can start to measure if we start to focus on what are the outflows of cash in later years.
That's a great point, Scott. I think the idea that there is a cost to poor health that in some ways can be mitigated if planning is taken up front, I think is a key point. In a place like Canada, where health is a universal care and you're not directly paying for it, but it's paid through taxes, the point that you're making that there's other costs, whether it's reduced lifespan or support services or quality of life, that needs to be factored in, and the impact on surviving spouse, etc. That's a very interesting concept, and a role that, in my view, I think financial advisors can play in to kind of help bring that to bear in the planning process, that it's not just about hard dollar costs that you have for retirement or retirement health spending or retirement home spending, etc. It's some of these soft dollar costs as well.
Yeah, maybe what I'll add is changes essentially in healthcare with chronic care. We're seeing governments move towards capping those dollars, which means that that's going to come from more and more from out-of-pocket expenses that aren't necessarily representative if you're looking just at historical data. We know that the changes coming in the healthcare and in the hospital systems are already changing far more than people are aware until they find themselves in that situation.
You talked about Wealthspan, and I would like to dig in a little bit deeper into that. That concept, it's interesting. It's combining the financial, the physical, the mental, and the social concepts. How, in your talks, in your discussions, how have you seen this concept, that it's not one single thing, it's all of this, resonate with people, particularly when we're looking at today's world where everything is fast-paced? Financial stability and health are often seen as competing priorities.
I think so where I get a lot of feedback, particularly in the classroom, where you get that opportunity, but we certainly see it on like on LinkedIn. I try to post some information there every day. There is a growing awareness, and so the two questions that come back to me from people are often on the health side: why isn't my doctor telling me this stuff? Right, and there are lots of reasons why doctors don't do that. We don't need to get into that today, but the other, more to your audience perhaps, is why is my financial advisor talking to me about this stuff? And so, because we're starting to understand how connected these all are. And so I look at it as Wealthspan. We can look at clients' financial health as being a three-legged stool. One leg being wealth, the other being health, and the other being housing. Upset any one of those, and it's going to pull the other two down with it. And so I think that's what people are. I try to be as direct as I can and transparent, and people they get it. It's more that, why haven't we been having the conversations? Right? So we kind of, like, there's things you say to someone and say, yeah, I kind of knew that all along, but I've actually never articulated the thought, or it's never come up in conversation. So that's where I try to dig into what are the conversations we're having in our head and we're rationalizing, but we're not having them with each other, for whatever reasons we've avoided it. So I think there's clients, I think, really value a more holistic approach, because they want to know that someone else is looking at it from multiple perspectives and helping ask questions to them to look at it from different perspectives, because it's really hard to be forward-looking in our own lives. We all tend to I ask a 9-year-old, I feel like I'm in my 20s. Right? We hear people say that all the time. And so everything that kind of connects this concept of wealth, health and lifespan together is actually how we operate every day. We just don't tend to think about it that way.
That's a great point. It isn't necessarily that it's complex. A lot of things, I believe, isn't. I mean, investing, for instance, I always say it's simple, but it's not easy. And what I mean by that is that conceptually, there's nothing hard about it. It's the behavior component that makes it very difficult. And there is an element, I believe, that people may be having these thoughts, but they may also be feeling that it's just them, that this is a concern that they have that isn't really a legitimate concern. They're not doing something right. Everybody else has got it figured out, and it's just me that doesn't have it figured out. And what I understand you saying is that a financial advisor that can help bring that to bear, ask those questions, is almost giving the client permission to feel this way, to look at things that aren't quantifiable or immediate, and feel good that they're actually thinking about some of these longer term pieces that are going to have major impact on their lives.
Yeah, well, one of the things I've started to do for the financial community is to provide it's a 6-part series that I came up with. Again, having worked them and talked them for many years, is there's an education component, but the part that I think the financial industry has really stared away from is letting clients talk to each other, right? Because that's where, like, your situation is different than mine. And if I line everybody up in a table or in a room, we start to discover there are many different scenarios, and mine may look a little bit like, 3 other people kind of put together a composite. And so it's a way to invite conversation around these topics that just allow clients to talk together and start to now fuel a conversation. I think that's always an enlightenment that I think the advisor or the financial community has not tapped into. It's tended to all be one way. Like, people will say, "Well, you give me a talk." I don't do many talks anymore for, like, the half-hour talk to promote my book or something, because I can't give you what you need in a half an hour. I can't give you what your clients really need if you're going to invest in your clients. And so for me, it's once I started to do this and I see the aha moments as people start to come out of there, and the energy that happens when they come out of there, and the advisors involved in it kind of say, "Thank you. Like, I didn't know how to start that conversation." And they don't even need to have the conversation, but people want to have this conversation. So providing a venue to have the conversation is a lot of what this is about, I think, and it's maybe harder to do one-on-one because it feels too personal. So what are the other ways that we can do that to facilitate it?
That's a great point. And along those lines, the question that pops into my head is, how do you address the challenge, or how does a financial advisor address the challenge of helping individuals shift their mindset when it comes to positive aging? One example that I want to use here is from your book, which I think is apropos. I think you talked about the idea of a best before date, that you use the example that nearly every packaged food item has a best before date. We understand that from the health benefits of early intervention before disease, but we don't think about it in other aspects, the other legs of the stool, housing, for example. So the example that you talk about is that, and most listeners can relate to this, is that we invest substantial energy in preparing for a newborn to arrive, but we don't necessarily do the same in thinking about how we prepare our housing for our later years, etc. And that's a mindset issue. Can you talk a little bit about that as to how you would approach it and how financial advisors might be able to approach it?
Sure. So again, we kind of come back to say, what are the things that are going to impact your future in terms of future net worth, and one of them will be how protected you are by your home. So your home is there to provide a service to you, right? Is your home supporting you over the years of life. And I'll tell you, one of the changes coming is our homes will be, we saw it through the pandemic, more people started work from home. So one of the changes that happening primarily, again, because of some capping on healthcare spend, but also tech and labor shortages, but also technologies coming that is going to intentionally keep people in their home much longer. And so I kind of tell people this idea that you have an option of aging in place is being eroded. You probably don't have, it's probably only going to be. And so if we think about it, we can wait until the last possible minute. Would we do that? Well, until I actually see the baby born, I don't know if I want to go to all that trouble, right, of the shopping, because maybe it won't happen. Well, it's kind of like as though old age won't happen or death won't happen. It's going to happen. And so given it's going to happen, we have two choices. We can bury our head in the sand, pretend it's not going to happen, or we can take a positive view, which we would say in past generations, of celebrating elderhood and to say, what an opportunity that I have, right? And what did I retire for? I didn't retire to stay young. I retired to grow old in a way of my choosing. And so my choosing hopefully is around positive things. So if we think about a positive mindset, why wouldn't I choose my home? And this is really one of the first things I did when I got into aging was I started to go through and to say, find clients who had disposable income, who wanted the ultimate aging experience at home. So they said, I plan to stay in my home. I don't have anything. I may have the money to do any number of things. I want to do it well. How can I do it well? But I don't want a place that looks institutional, because that's what the aging industry has done. So if we think about creating a home the way we would kind of the nursery, say, we put all the colors and things on the walls and, things hanging from the ceiling, mobiles and things. What if we decorated our home both from an aesthetic and a functional standpoint so that it would serve us throughout our remaining years for any number of eventualities? It doesn't mean we need to design it like a nursing home. So I had the opportunity, just as circumstances evolved when I moved to Virginia a couple of years ago. I had the opportunity to design and build our own home. So I'll try to do this on a show at some point, is to show people this is what the modern home looks like, this design for a lifetime. It doesn't look any different than it. No one comes in and sees anything because there's an element to doing it that it's really appealing. And so as soon as it's appealing, you're now, your home is open to people coming to stay socially interactive with you in later years. And it's someplace you look at and, you talk about peace of mind of things that cause anxiety, knowing that best before date, your home isn't really going to serve well until you're maybe 75, 78, depending if something happens. So this best before date is what we want to push that out as long as we can in our home, to really make sure that it has its best before date is beyond age 100, perhaps. Like, we don't want our home to be the barrier to now have to kind of run up against and say, now what are we going to do? We want to ideally stretch that out as long as we can, because that really gives us as many options and lowers our later life costs as well.
This concept should appeal to financial advisors because it's very much along the lines of planning and preparation. You don't want to deal with circumstances in the heat of the moment, because some of these things require thinking, they require preparation, require iteration, because it doesn't, the first manifestation of it may not be the one that you end up with. You have to think it through to say, do we need extra stories? Is this how we want to be climbing in later years? Or is there something that we look at that is going to accommodate that when we're perhaps may not be able to take the stairs as frequently?
Yeah, it's a strategy, right? Like everything, like I actually view it as a portfolio, right? We view an investment portfolio as having the elements to maximize returns and minimize risk, or at least balance those two. And so our home should be the same approach as a portfolio of, here are the sorts of things that we want our home to be able to do. How do we get the most out of it? Or ideally we get everything out of it, but that's okay. If we get 80 or 90%, we're still going to be well ahead of where most people are. And if we approach it that way as a strategy, we can say, okay, what should we do first? And there's financial decisions as part of that, right? So I think in the book, I give a model, an example of put $50,000 in at retirement, or retirement, maybe you work another 6 or 9 months to get that, to really equip your home with the things you would like to have it to now become a lifespan or a lifetime home. $50,000 sounds like a lot of money to everybody. But flip that around and say, what are the late life costs, or what's the return on that investment down the road? Forgetting about even the emotional investment, the hard returns on that are really easy. So I tell you, in the US, the return on that is going to be, in today's dollars, about 6 months. So if it allows you to stay in your home 6 months longer, you're going to have that. But in reality, you're going to have a much better life experience by kind of setting your home up in a way that's going to serve you for many years, in a style and aesthetics that's to your choosing, versus that. Well, the classic one is, mom's had a fall and going to be released from hospital, but can't come home because the home isn't set up to allow her to get in and out of the house safely or move around the house. So what are we going to do? We're going to have to find interim care. And then, while she heals and while we get work done in the house, and getting a contractor to show up, and actually give you a price and do the work. Yeah, that's not a weekend activity. Those are difficult decisions. So everything just gets escalated the later you leave it. And so you do a client a great service by kind of helping them think through those things early.
Makes total sense. And on that note, for financial advisors, what do you think are the key considerations or the key conversations, I should say, they should be having with their clients to get them to start thinking along these lines, aligning their the wealth, their health, their housing, at least start thinking about how those three play together well in advance?
Yeah, I think we don't have to overcomplicate it. We don't have to overburden advisors with this. A lot of what I have found, this is what I tell to my students, my goal in teaching is pretty simple. All I want to do is help you ask better questions. So what information can I feed to you, or questions that I can pose to you that will cause you to ask better questions? And so I think on this, one of the questions is we talk about horizon planning, right? So, are you using the default of 95 years? What are we planning towards? And money is only one of those things. And so, if we're having that conversation with a client to say, is 95 the year we're going to plan for? How is your housing? Is your housing set up for 95? What's that strategy look like? Or what are the scenarios you have in mind for that? It's a question, right? The client could say, none of your business, I don't want to talk about it. Done, right? You've given them a chance. How do you feel about your health outlook around achieving that, right? It's simply not that you have to have answers to it. It's really helping the client to start to think about these other levers that are going to have a big impact on that number, not just the amount of money. Having all the money you need and then giving it all away to the healthcare system. I don't know anyone who spent a career working with that as their idea. It makes as much sense. Well, I want to make as much money as I can so I can turn around and pay it in taxes, right? It's the same concept. So we want to preserve that equity, but we also want to preserve quality of life. So I think it's really around how do we figure out to ask questions, and then it would be, if they're interested, great. So let me know, or let them know that you want to partner with them. I want to support you. I don't have the sort of things to come in and modify your home, but I can certainly help provide some resources for you to do that, or get a group together to talk about it together so you can learn from each other. There are ways to do that don't encroach on the regulatory environment that the industry obviously has to work on. So those to me are really just the like we need to be asking questions and allowing some conversation to essentially normalize these conversations the same way we would normalize market volatility. We don't want you getting anxious just because the market fell 50 points or 100 points yesterday. These are the normal things. It'll recover. The difference, of course, is the housing challenge will not recover if we haven't planned for it well. Health may or may not recover depending on what the disease is. So these are all things that we should be normalizing as part of our conversation.
I totally agree. I've always believed that the role of an advisor is to ask questions, lots of questions, and maybe the point I would emphasize is that those questions should also be more open-ended and perhaps on non-monetary things to get ideas and things going through the client's mind. The idea of saying that we're planning from a financial perspective till age 95. How does housing play into this plan? Are you planning to retire and stay in this home for that whole time period? What might be needed to make sure that you can live there when you're 75, 85? And asking those kind of questions and the more open-ended and less directive it can be is, I think, helpful. And these may be questions the client has never heard, never thought of. And I think the important thing is that that's okay. It's in fact, it's not necessary for either the advisor or even the client to have an answer to that question.
Right.
It's that the question is asked, that it sits there in their subconscious, and maybe a week, maybe a month, maybe 3 months later, they come back and say, you've made me think. And yeah, I realized that I hadn't really planned. Yes, we've got a financial plan till 95, but I don't have a housing plan. I don't have a health plan. I want to explore that a bit more.
Yeah, and some of these just require time. So I'll give you my own example is I have 4 sons. 2 of them live in Canada, 2 in the US, and they're in 4 different cities. So if my later life plan is to be a resident near them, which one is it going to be?
Mm-hmm.
I can't answer that today,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't want to have to answer that in a crisis situation,
Mm-hmm.
right? I would like to, over time, kind of see how their lives evolve. They may move 3 times between now and when that
Absolutely.
decision may come up anyway. But the point is, time to process this in low stress conditions, get to test it out are really great opportunities. But if it's only if we ask the questions early enough just to see the answer, and it's to your point, right? And I don't need an answer, but these are the kind of questions that are really going to matter, because we may want to adjust your planning in terms of financial planning to make sure that we're accommodating it.
Like the 50,000 that you talked about that you might want to spend in just before retirement to upgrade
Right.
your home, etc.
Right.
What are some common misconceptions, Scott, that people have about the relationship between wealth and health, and how do you challenge those beliefs in your book?
So one of them is this notion of that disease only happens to poor people, or the
Yep.
less affluent, but we're always, or that it only happens to those who don't have a healthy lifestyle, right? That, or flip it around and say, well, because I'm a runner, I'm not going to get heart disease and I'm not going to get cancer.
Mm-hmm.
These are common things that, and what it is we're rationalizing
Mm-hmm.
all the time, right? And so if we think about kind of the health and wealth piece, I think it's really around a very holistic view to say what is wealth or the health across not just my lifespan, but across my family or my loved one's lifespan. And so that really involves, and this is where I kind of see the particularly in the husband and wife scenario, where they are programmed differently, right? So we know that, interestingly, the men focus on the money and the women focus on the nurturing and care of the family. Traditionally, these are kind of what we see, right? And then we can kind of take it later in life. And so particularly the scenario plays out where the husband is older and will typically die sooner and have disease issues earlier. The survivor's left with the wife who's so focused on caring for her husband, wanting to make sure he has the right care, and then what she left with at the end of the day. And so this is the issue around what's going to be there for the survivor. These are really difficult decisions to make again in the crisis, particularly once you commit to something. So,
Right.
so I have people come and talk to me. I was out cycling, and one of the guys cycling, he's a doctor, and he talked to me about it. And it was just the two of us. We were waiting for the other group to get there, and he was telling me about the scenario with his mother, that the kids were all adult kids caring for their mother and in a facility, and they said, we didn't really expect her to live this long, and she could easily go another couple of years. And he said, quite honestly, I can't afford it anymore. I'm not going to have enough for my own retirement. And so it's but what do you do at that point? Right? So this is the difficulty if we're not kind of making those bigger holistic plans to say, whoever goes first, what's that scenario? And whoever goes second, what's that scenario? So I think it really is that big, 40,000 foot view of what is wealth to you? What's the purpose of wealth? What is health to you? What's the importance of that in terms of active, minimizing morbidity? So maybe that's the other, just to throw in here, is there's people will rationalize all sorts of things. One is that, well, I don't want to live too long because that's going to increase my risk of Alzheimer's and kind of being in a nursing home. If you're worried about getting to 110, that's maybe more legitimate. But in reality, is the healthier we remain, the less our morbidity period is at the end of life, and the longer we live. So if we work the numbers, it's generally worth about another decade of life. So for a 65-year-old, that's worth about another decade of healthy years with no or probably less morbidity at the end of life than they would have had living shorter. So it's so just to kind of take it one step further, and I mentioned earlier about trends in Canada follow the US. So in the US, if you look at mortality data, since 2010, life expectancy flatline in the US. And I go back and I dig right into that data. What's actually happened in the US is that for every person living longer, one is dying sooner. That's unprecedented in modern history, right? And so we're starting to see the same thing happen in Canada. It's not there yet. It's still lagging behind. So it's this same scenario of how do I take a bigger, more broader look at what does wealth and health mean to me and to my family? And these are conversations with partners that we don't always have either, right? It's so again, it's a question an advisor could ask at the table with a couple, like, so what does wealth and health mean to you? Like, why are we doing this? That's what I could, like, why are we bothering to accumulate all this money? What's it for? We think it's an obvious answer, but I can tell you that people will surprise you with their responses.
Well, that's a great point. And asking both partners in a relationship is critical. You do that in risk tolerance, and you find that just because they're married or been living together doesn't mean that they both share the same risk tolerance. But asking them, what does wealth mean to them, or what does health mean to them, or what does their housing plan in their later years, etc., asking both husband and wife or partners or whatever it is an interesting conversation to have, because to your point, likely that conversation's perhaps not even occurred between the partners, let alone in front of the advisor.
Yeah, it's like, you could take, like, I'm an architect, for example. What am I designing for, right? A financial planner is designing for something. It's not simply acquiring as much money as possible. That's clearly, through the accumulation phase. But in terms of talking about retirement, it's a place I would say the industry has really, I'll say that there's a lot of opportunity. That's the positive way of spinning.
No, I believe
right?
I believe you're 100% right. There is a lot of opportunity, and we're just starting to get to the point where these conversations are occurring for whole bunch of reasons, sociographic, demographic, etc. Maybe I can have one quick follow-up question before we end the podcast. Along the lines that you just talked about, do you have any thoughts or suggestions for advisors and how they might think about measuring and tracking the progress of their clients and helping them achieve this balanced wealth span, looking at metrics beyond the traditional plan metrics, etc.?
Right. So I think if I kind of use the traditional, are you planning to downsize your house? Right. So we'd kind of put that and when, and so we'll say, whatever the house is worth and maybe the downsize, you're going to make some assumption. I think that's an example of an opportunity to go in deeper, to say, okay, well, let's look at housing across the plan and so we have milestones. And by virtue of putting a milestone into the plan, every subsequent visit, right? We're not talking about solving all of this in one client meeting. It's over the period of the relationship. Where are we on that housing plan, right? So these are questions to ask. Has that changed, like around kind of what your views are? Or, again, I mentioned like my kids, well, they've moved and somewhere, has moved in a location. No, I couldn't go there. Well, actually, one's moved to a great location. We're thinking about moving earlier, right? So these are fluid plans, but I think everything, what I would like to see are things that we can measure in terms of activity, right? Because this is the hardest thing we see in retirement is paralysis. We get paralyzed over making a decision to act. I call it, when with couples, to say it's partner paralysis. One says, you're taking me out of here feet first, and the other says, I can't wait I know the place I want to go. And so they kind of wait to see who's going to be the first to die. Kind of a strategy is the extreme, right? It's these are measurable milestones. So I'll kind of use that upgrades to the home. Well, where are we on that? Right? Have you done that? This is anything that kind of breaks the paralysis or helps them make a decision around some of what you might feel are non-financial matters, clearly are financial matters. And I think that's kind of drop that in. There's a lot of activities come up in the industry around non-financial planning, which has big financial implications in many times. And so understanding what's going on in that space that I maybe should be more aware of. And so I think the housing is the obvious one. Yeah, around asking questions around where has anything changed in health. And again, I get in terms of privacy around health information. So it's not that you need to know anything about a disease, but is there anything changing in your health that you think will impact your housing? Right? And and it could be that you're going to be caring for an older parent coming in the home at some point. How is that? Is that parent bringing equity to the to this? Are they going to be, or maybe it's a child, right? We see more and more of that that the children are on. So they're places we historically touch on, but I think we just need to kind of peel it back and start to allow a conversation to happen. Clients need a partner in this. They don't get to talk about the money implications in a real sense. They'll talk about how much they spent on the home or upgrades, but they don't have a partner in the thought process around the planning concept.
I like that. Scott, we're coming to the end of our podcast, so I have a few final rapid fire questions for you that I ask all my guests. So number one, professionally, what is the most important lesson you've learned over the years?
I'd say volatility isn't nearly as scary as change. It's probably the one thing I've done in my career is lead people through change. They understand market volatility. They've heard about it. Change is far scarier. And so it takes time to set people up and lead them through change.
And change is inevitable. So I think this is an important guidance or help to not fear it, but prepare for it. Number two, what is one practical tip you would offer listeners keen on applying the insights that you've shared?
I think one of them would be complacency is the enemy of growth. The industry is traditionally very resistant to change themselves. And so, they'll come up with reasons why they don't think they can do that or why they don't think they have a role to play. And so clearly the industry is changing. Just a question of, are you going to be at the front end of that change, or are you going to be at a laggard at the back end? And that's going to be an expensive place to find yourself. So I think really thinking about how can I grow with the changing market that's coming ahead of me, and I don't mean the financial market in terms of the consumer market that we're serving.
That's a great point, and it comes up to the point you made earlier when you said that we're at the forefront of this. There is an opportunity if one chooses to see it that way and prepare themselves accordingly. Scott, thank you for a great discussion, timely discussion. If listeners want to learn more about you or find your work, where should they go?
So they can find it about the book Wealthspan through the website. So it's Healthspan with a W in front of it, or a Wealthspan with an H stuck in, whichever works for you. It gets you to the same place. Probably LinkedIn is the one place. I try to put a couple of kind of thoughtful posts in there daily that, late studies that are happening, changes in the marketplace, that a fair number of people seem to find that is helpful. I've had a lot of good feedback and a lot of interest there. Those are the two. And then, you can always reach out to me. I don't need to give email out. That's an easy one for people to chase. I'm not a hard person to find. So, I really enjoy the interactive experiences that we have with clients and professionals. So, like you, Sam, I just really appreciate these kind of conversations. And I think the more that we have, the better the industry will be.
Couldn't agree more. Scott, this has been awesome. Thank you for joining us today on the Future Ready Advisor.
Thanks. Take good care.
In this episode, I spoke with Scott Fulton, author of the book Wealthspan. Here are my 3 key takeaways from our discussion. Number 1, plan holistically across wealth, health, and housing. Scott emphasizes that these 3 elements are interconnected. Ignoring one can destabilize the others. Financial advisors play a vital role in helping clients think beyond financial metrics to plan for long-term housing suitability and health-related costs. Number 2, think beyond crisis planning. Proactive decisions like preparing homes for aging or aligning health goals with financial plans minimize last-minute and costly choices. Scott's best before date analogy reminds us to think ahead about when our living arrangements might need an upgrade to serve us better as we age. Number 3, facilitate honest, open conversations. Clients often have unspoken concerns about aging and longevity. Scott highlights the value of asking questions about their health, housing, and wealth plans to normalize these topics and ensure alignment with their values and future needs. This episode showcases why the most successful advisors aren't just wealth managers, they're life strategists. Thank you for listening to the Future Ready Advisor. You've been listening to the Future Ready Advisor. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify, or share your feedback wherever you listen. Be sure to follow the podcast so you never miss an episode. For more insights on how to keep your practice future ready, visit www.samsivarajan.com. You can find the link on the show notes. There you'll find free tools and resources along with exclusive bonus content from these podcasts. Thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to sharing more strategies with you in the next episode.